the British pointed out how you can go through the pico colonies and you see Arabs and Jews sitting together chatting on porches. They were neighbors. They were friendly, had friendly relations, which was a great contrast to the Zionist organization colonies.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
Speak peace like a Buddhist.
A unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Leavitt.
Hey, thank you so much, Rachel, for that wonderful introduction. You are indeed listening to that great podcast in the sky, And If Love Remains. And I am its messenger, Mike Leavitt. And I am very excited to have back on the program investigator journalist, recent Soho debate victor, and good friend of the program, Jeremy Hammond. Welcome back, brother.
Thanks for having me on again, Mike. Always a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely, man. Absolutely my pleasure. Hey, I want to jump right into this thing because you just recently had a debate with the Soho Forum. The Soho Forum is probably, in fact, I don't think it's probably, is the premier libertarian debate forum. I think it's sponsored by Reason TV, if I'm not mistaken. Gene Epstein puts it on, does a wonderful job, and he always gets incredible debaters on, and this was no exception. So yeah, it was great to did I miss anything about the Soho Forum that I should know about, that the audience should know about?
No, you're correct. Gene Epstein runs it, but I think it's a partnership with the Reason Foundation, or Reason Foundation is I don't know. They have something to do with it as well. So right. That's all correct. Yeah.
Okay. And they anybody should look up on Reason TV, on YouTube, or anywhere Soho Forum and check out those debates, because there's lots of them. This particular debate, I think, was especially poignant just because the circumstances we're in, and it was the question that was on the table was something to the effect of Palestinians' refusal to acknowledge Israel is the root cause, or what is the root cause of the conflict in Palestine?
Yeah, the debate resolution was the root cause of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the Palestinians' rejection of Israel's right to return. And so journalist Eli Lake, argued the affirmative, and I argued the negative to that.
Okay. Now, I wasn't familiar with Eli Lake. Did you know of his work? Did you kind of know what you were walking into?
His name was familiar to me from way back when. At the time, I was speaking out against the Iraq War. He was one of the guys who was advocating the Iraq War. So that's how I kind of knew of him. And okay. He was somewhat familiar with his name, was from that era.
Right. And just because I have never participated in a debate like this, I'm kind of curious about some of the ancillary things, I guess. First of all, did you guys have a chance to meet and chat before, and how did that go? What was that like?
Yeah, we both arrived at the forum, a little bit early, just to get there on time and be prepared. So we got to meet before the debate. He was very kind. We did chat for a bit. Afterwards, he was also very kind, came up and congratulated me. So I was very happy that it turned out to be a civil discussion, despite although he did have some somewhat frustrated objections to some of my points. But it was just civil the whole time. There was no name calling or anything like that. I wasn't accused of anti-Semitism, and so that was nice for a change.
Right. No, it was, I thought, very good. There weren't a lot of, as you said, personal attacks. It was on the subject, and while we can agree or disagree on the facts or what the arguments are, the logical arguments, it's always nice to have a debate where you have mutual combatants that are respectful to each other, at least. Um, now, one of the great these are one of some of my favorite debates. This style, this kind of Oxford style of debating, yet both sides in a without it turning into a shouting match. Each side gets a chance to present the argument, which actually gives me one more question. Since you were arguing against, did you have a chance to know what his opening statement was, or what you were going to be specifically arguing against?
No, I had to try to anticipate everything he might bring up, which I think I did a fairly good job of doing. He argued, for example, that the Palestinians' rejection of Israel's right to exist. An example of that was their rejection of the 1937 Peel Commission partition proposal, the 1947 UN partition plan, rejection of generous offers by Israel during the peace process, Camp David specifically. And I successfully anticipated each of those arguments. And so I already had in my written opening remarks rebuttals to those arguments. So I think I did a pretty good job of kind of anticipating the types of arguments he would make.
Yeah. So first of all, one of the things again, I want to maybe ask some more poignant or more pointed questions in a little bit, but I one of the things I appreciated about what you did linguistically, I guess, is number one. I think you were smart to really focus on property rights, really focus on the how people have rights and not states. I think that was a really smart way to go. And also, I appreciated, and I don't know how purposeful this was on your part, but I think there's 3 or 4 times where you actually talked about Israel talking about occupying the land from the river to the sea, and because that's such a that's often said, by those who are pro-Palestinian, those who are trying to, and those that are, well, it's just, let me just ask it that way. What was that purposeful, and kind of talk about using that language that can sometimes can be a little bit hot.
Sure. I mean, we've seen in the case of pro, uh, pro human rights activists, what we might call pro Palestinian activists on college campuses and so forth. Where we're told that when they chant "Palestine will be free from the river to the sea," that this is an anti-Semitic slogan, that it's incitement to genocide. And so I didn't specifically refer to this argument, but I did allude to it by pointing out that, in fact, long before Hamas even existed, extreme Zionists, particularly the Likud, from the Likud party, were using that slogan essentially to declare. I mean, then I cited the 1977 Likud Charter, which says that from the river to the sea there will only be Israeli sovereignty. And so, if this is a genocidal slogan, well, the Zionists had claim to that slogan first. So I did use the phrase several times, referring to also. I mentioned it again, referring to just this past September. In fact, I think it was just like 2 weeks before the 10/7 attacks in Israel. Netanyahu was at the UN General Assembly, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he held up a map of what was described on the map as the new Middle East, and it showed Israel with no Palestinian territories from the river to the sea. And so I mentioned that. And so, the point being to kind of to preempt that whole claim that, anyone who calls for freeing Palestine from the river to the sea, that this argument that this is anti-Semitic and it's genocidal. And it's like, well, okay, then Likud was genocidal before Hamas was genocidal.
Right. Right. The double standards is all over the place with these arguments. And I think that's another thing you pointed out a lot. It was the double standards that if, and we could talk about a lot of different points, but if, well, here's an example. let me back up. Because I want to press you a little bit on this one because I think there is a um, legitimate argument, and we can say, well, um, it's Israel's fault. They've been they've been uh, basically having the Palestinians in an apartheid state for over 50 years. And they've treated them horribly, and so yes, there is a lot of anti-Semitism. Nonetheless, there is a lot of anti-Semitism there. There is a blowback, as a phrase that would happen and does happen, and I the recent events kind of point to that. And so Israel does have a legitimate security concern. I don't think Eli pressed that point a little bit, but as much as I think he could have. But I think there is a legitimate concern that um, in fact, you mentioned it yourself. If it was a true democracy, the country would be called Palestine, not Israel. Well, if that's true, then that would be a huge problem for the Jews that do live there presently. However, we got to this point. Right now, if those walls were to come down, there could be issues. So talk about like Israel's security concern.
Sure. As I mentioned in the debate, I condemned the atrocities of October 7th. There's no possible justification for indiscriminate massacring of civilians by Hamas, of Israeli civilians. And I also pointed out that Israelis have a right to national self-defense. But Israel also has both moral and legal obligation to exercise that right in accordance with international humanitarian law. And as I said, there's also no possible justification for the horrific atrocities perpetrated by Israel against Palestinian civilians in Gaza, with what the International Court of Justice has ruled is a plausible genocide in Gaza. Under South Africa's case, where South Africa filed an application at the ICJ accusing Israel of violating the 1948 Genocide Convention.
Okay. Um, and and while that's true, I mean, wouldn't you agree that if there was a two-state solution, or if the Israel did annex all of the country and made them, let's even make the case that they made them full participants in their democracy, wouldn't that cause like some major concerns for the Jews that do live there?
It's something like that would have to be done in stages. Obviously, I mean, you couldn't just change it overnight and expect, anything other than kind of a chaotic situation. We don't want to create more chaos. We want to de-escalate the situation, not escalate the situation. But ultimately, if you did that, I mean, consider this. I mean, people point to Hamas as an example of Palestinians' rejection of Israel's right to exist. But the fact is that Hamas is a consequence and not the cause of the conflict. And it's precisely Israel's policies that have empowered Hamas while sidelining and discrediting and undermining moderate leadership of the Palestinians. Yasser Arafat was making incredible concessions during the so-called peace process. And of course, the language that is used to describe events of the peace process is completely prejudicial, where you have New York Times and other mainstream media saying things like that Israel made enormous concessions, that Israel was willing to cede land to the Palestinians, that East Jerusalem, describing East Jerusalem as disputed territory. All of this language operates in a framework of what Israel wants. And as I pointed out in the debate, the proper framework for discussion is rather what both parties are legally entitled to. And under international law, all of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are occupied Palestinian territories. And so, looked at in the proper framework for analysis, all of the concessions made at Camp David came from the Palestinian side, none from the Israelis. And the so-called generous offer consisted of Israeli demands for the Palestinians to surrender rights and to give up more of their own land to Israel. And so Israel made zero concessions at Camp David, and it wasn't even an offer. It was demands for the Palestinians to give up even more. And Arafat went in saying his position was really clear. He went into Camp David saying, "We will not accept less than our internationally recognized rights." Real clear and simple. And yet Bill Clinton basically acted as Israel's advocate in pushing the Israeli demands on the Palestinians, blaming Arafat for the failure of the talks afterwards, despite promising that he wouldn't do that to get him to even come, because Arafat went reluctantly to Camp David. He was already very highly discredited as the Palestinian leader because of signing on to the Oslo Accords, and the Palestinians got nothing from that, including not only was there not a cessation of the settlement, the illegal settlement activity in the West Bank, but it actually increased. Netanyahu came to power in the late 90s and did his utmost to essentially sideline any kind of peace negotiations and to undermine any kind of peace negotiations with the Palestinians. And of course, and then he came back to power later on. He was in power in the late 90s, and then we had Barak and Sharon, Olmert. There was a number of different prime ministers, but Netanyahu has been in power now for quite a long time. And the entire time, he has maintained a policy of essentially utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally to block any movement towards peace negotiations with the Palestinians. And even before Netanyahu, I mean, Israel policy from the beginning with Hamas was to essentially support Hamas as a counterforce to the PLO, because there was this threat of peace from the PLO. Because in 1988, well, it's going back to the 1970s, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, Arafat's organization, was expressing its willingness to accept the two-state solution, which is premised on Resolution 242, passed after the 1967 war, calling on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. And so the two-state solution is essentially an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, and a just resolution to the Palestinian refugee problem that arose from the 1948 war, when Israel was created by ethnically cleansing most of the Arab population from their homes. And so from the mid-1970s, Arafat was essentially expressing his willingness to accept what had become an international consensus in favor of the two-state solution. In 1988, the PLO officially declared its acceptance of the two-state solution based on Resolution 242, with an end to the occupation and without prejudice to the right of return, which was already an enormous concession from the Palestinian leadership, because they were essentially saying, we're willing to accept a Palestinian state in just 22% of our historic homeland. And so that was already a huge concession on the part of the Palestinians, because we have to remember that the what are sometimes called the 1967 lines, which is synonymous with the 1949 armistice lines, or the Green Line, named for the color with which it was drawn on the map at the time. These are not borders. Israel has no internationally recognized borders, which incidentally is one of the criteria for statehood under international law, but set that aside. They're armistice lines. And during the 1948 war, Israel conquered territory well beyond that proposed for the Jewish state under the UN partition plan, which was recommending that about 56% of Palestine go to the Jews for their state. And during the war, Israel ended up conquering about 78% of the land of Palestine. And looking at the partition plan, there's this big myth, to touch on that real quick, that a lot of people believe that the UN created Israel. But the fact is that Resolution 181, which was the partition plan resolution, the General Assembly resolution that endorsed the partition plan, Resolution 181 neither partitioned Palestine nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionist leadership for their unilateral declaration of Israel's existence on May 14th, 1948, by which time 250,000 Arabs had already been ethnically cleansed. We're told that the Arabs started that war and that the neighboring Arab states sent in their armies to wipe Israel off the map. Well, first of all, Israel didn't exist as a legally defined entity. And so what happened was that the neighboring Arab states entered Palestine to try to stop the ethnic cleansing operations and mostly failed. And Jordan managed to hang on to the West Bank while Egypt held on to the tiny Gaza Strip. And so, again, already by the time the neighboring Arab states militarily intervened, over 250,000 Arabs had already been ethnically cleansed. So who started the war?
Right.
And so that was 48, and then so that is how Israel came into existence, was by ethnically cleansing most of the Arab population. Jews at the time, at the end of the mandate, owned only about 7% of the land in Palestine. And a UN subcommittee that was a subcommittee under what was called the UN Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, which was the committee that came up with the partition plan. The majority recommendation of that committee was the partition plan. There was also a minority recommendation that was saying that the majority recommendation actually violates the UN Charter because it's premised on a rejection of Palestinian self-determination, which was readily admitted in the UNSCOP report. And I pointed that out, and I quoted from it in the debate, where they said that the principle of self-determination was not applied to Palestine, obviously because of the intention to make possible the Jewish national home, which is just a euphemism for the Jewish state. So the partition plan was explicitly premised on a rejection of Palestinians' right to self-determination. And the subcommittee under UNSCOP pointed out that in the proposed Jewish state itself, when you didn't exclude the Bedouin population, Arabs were actually the majority still, and they owned more land, even within the proposed Jewish state. So the partition plan was totally inequitable. And the Palestinians and the Arab leadership were absolutely within reason to reject that absurd plan. And not only that, and then you look at the map of what was proposed, and the Jewish state that was proposed would have been contiguous, whereas the Palestinian state was broken up into these 3 non-contiguous areas. It was completely absurd. And the idea that the Arabs were somehow unreasonable to reject that plan is absolutely ludicrous and ahistorical. But this is an example of the type of just propaganda that people are inundated with their entire lives, that we're supposed to believe that the rejection of the UN partition plan was just shows how incapable of reasoning the Palestinians are. But we just need to set the historical record straight and look at it in terms of equal rights of both peoples. Coming back to the point here about security, so it is Israel's policies itself that has Israel itself, through its policies, has essentially empowered the more radical extremists among the Palestinians, such as within Hamas, while undermining deliberately more moderate elements who have been willing and expressed willingness to accept the 2-state solution for decades. Again, going back to the mid-1970s. And so this is the consequence of Israel's own policies and Israel's refusal to reason, because the essential premise of modern political Zionism is that they want all of the land of Palestine, but without the Palestinians. And that's why Israel was created, through ethnic cleansing. It's why Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza in the 1967 war, an occupation which persists to this day. It's no longer really tenable to perceive it as a temporary occupation. Israel has essentially, it is a permanent regime of systematic discrimination and oppression, and systematic violation of the Palestinians' fundamental human rights, which is the definition of apartheid under international law. So it is really unquestionably an apartheid regime, and numerous, UN agencies and numerous international human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Israeli human rights organizations like Yesh Din, B'Tselem, and Gisha have all, publicly concluded that it is an apartheid regime. And so, it's just not possible for Israel to have security when its policies escalate the threat of terrorism, and knowingly so. I mean, you have In 2003, there was a number of high-level officials, like from Shin Bet, which is Israel's domestic security agency, kind of like our FBI, and from the military establishment, criticizing the policies of Ariel Sharon for escalating the threat of terrorism. Saying things like, we have to recognize that there's another side, and that we are behaving disgracefully with our oppression of the Palestinians. Saying things to this effect, and recognizing how the policies were empowering Hamas, not weakening Hamas, empowering Hamas at the cost of the moderate leadership among the Palestinians. And this was deliberate. And again, this predates Netanyahu, but Netanyahu was quite open and explicit about utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally to block any movement towards peace negotiations. The basic idea being that as long as we have the Palestinian leadership divided between Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, there can't be any peace negotiations.
I think that it seems to be such a smoking gun. How do we know that that's true? Where can we verify that Netanyahu specifically and Israel for a while has been propping up Hamas and using them as a way to stymie the peace agreements?
Yeah, somebody actually asked that question in the Q&A after the debate, and I couldn't find the quote immediately at the time. But I pointed out that it's widely quoted. A statement that Netanyahu made has been widely quoted in the Israeli media, and it's never been disputed or denied. I mean, Netanyahu has never denied it, and nobody close to him has ever denied it. So he made a statement during a meeting of Likud members of the Knesset, and I can now pull it up. Let me see here. So the quote is this: anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. And there are all kinds of quotes from high-level Israeli officials, journalists in the Israeli media. It's just an openly acknowledged fact that this was his policy. I can quote from here's Ehud Barak.
Let me say this though, and I want you. Say that quote. Then I have
So he said in August 2019, referring to Netanyahu, he says, quote, his strategy is to keep Hamas alive and kicking, even at the price of abandoning the citizens, referring to, the Israeli citizens near Gaza, in order to weaken the PA in Ramallah. There's just quote after quote. Again, he said more recently, Barak again in 2023, in November, said that Netanyahu had shaped a strategy of whoever wants to make sure that we can block any possibility of a two-state solution, I'm quoting, has to support my position of keeping the Hamas strengthened and kicking and alive. So it's just kind of an openly acknowledged fact that this was his policy. And after 10/7, Netanyahu, his popularity plummeted, and because just very wide criticisms in the Israeli media of this policy, people literally blame him for the attacks being a consequence of his policy of utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally. So there really isn't any question about it or any doubt about it whatsoever. It's openly acknowledged in Israel itself that this was his policy. And I've never, ever seen that disputed in the Israeli media.
Okay. Now, given that as a fact now, what would you, for example, the United States makes deals with the devil all the time, for its own interest, whether, security or empire, as we might say. So this is not an unusual thing for a state to make deals or to support groups that would be in their benefit. How is this maybe different?
Well, it is quite similar to a lot of U.S. policies. I mean, look back at the Soviet-Afghan war when the CIA was supporting the Mujahideen, recruiting radical extremists to fight alongside. Al Qaeda got its start. Osama bin Laden's organization got its start during that era, working alongside the CIA out of Peshawar, Pakistan, to fight the Soviets in the U.S.'s proxy war against the Soviet Union. You have the Taliban arose out of the madrasas, the religious schools that the CIA was recruiting extremists from, encouraging the extremists, arming them, training them, right alongside Osama bin Laden. So the U.S. allying itself essentially with Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, with ISIS in Syria, in supporting the extremists against the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The Iraq War essentially created ISIS, destabilizing the region, empowering extremists. And the U.S. has had alliances with terrorist organizations throughout history, and so there is a similarity there in the utilization of extremists for a geostrategic purpose. As far as what's the difference or what our difference is, I really think I can't really think of anything there to contrast.
All the way around, huh?
It's a comparison, and to contrast it is difficult.
Yeah,
because that's what it is. It's essentially,
well, I think
it's policies that escalate the threat of terrorism for geostrategic purposes, and that really is the similarity.
Well, and I think as for people who are American centric, or people who think that it's good to promote American interests, whatever that might be. Whether that's making these sorts of deals. I guess one thing that is interesting that you mentioned is that this isn't a popular thing in Israel. I'm not sure we'd say the same thing about in the U.S., although I think it's losing popularity. Since 9/11, it's been still I think there's a lot of remnants of people wanting to prop up the American empire. So it's interesting to me that you say that maybe that's not as popular in Israel.
10/7 was blowback for Netanyahu, the same as 9/11 was blowback for U.S. policies.
Yeah. One of the arguments that Eli made is that Zionism at its core, or is fundamentally, or it's impossible for Zionism to be colonialists, that they are by definition anti-colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an interesting argument. I wouldn't call Gaza a colony of Israel, but talk about that. Like, is Zionism anti-colonialist? I'm sorry, I'm trying to find a good argument for that.
But, his basic argument is that the Jews have an ancient historical connection to the land. So if they return to the land, how can you call them colonizers? Well, the answer to that is simple. I mean, number one, first of all, anyone can convert to Judaism.
Right.
And so, and I pointed out how DNA studies show that Ashkenazi Jews, while along paternal lines, there is a close, there is ancestry to the Levant area, which is that region from, stretching from like Egypt to Syria. But along maternal lines, there was a lot of conversion to Judaism. And so, how strong is the ancestral connection to Palestine among many Ashkenazi Jews who immigrated from Europe? That's one question. But this to me is really beside the point. And I pointed this out in the debate. I just made the point that, property rights aren't based on DNA, and DNA is no basis for property rights. And so to deny that it was a settler-colonial project, modern political Zionism was a settler-colonial project by definition. In fact, you had colonization associations that had the word colonization in the title of their association. like the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, which was settling Jewish immigrants into Palestine alongside the Zionist organization. Although the British, in one of their reports investigating one of the outbreaks of violence of Arabs against Jews during the Mandate era, pointed out how this wasn't a result of anti-Semitism among the Arabs, but anti-Zionism. And they pointed out the distinction between the PICA colonies, which was the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, where they didn't have the same policies as the Zionist organization colonies, where the Zionist organization had a policy of, number one, buying up, exploiting feudalistic Ottoman land laws to purchase large plots of land from absentee landlords with prejudice towards the property rights of the poor Arab peasants who had homesteaded that land. And in cases that involved expulsions of entire villages of Arabs. But then once they purchased the land, and again, they only had managed to acquire about 7% of the territory of Palestine through purchase by the end of the Mandate. But once they purchased the land, it was their policy to deny Arabs any employment on the land. Whereas this wasn't the case in the PICA colonies. And the British pointed out how you can go through the PICA colonies and you see Arabs and Jews sitting together chatting on porches. They were neighbors. They had friendly relations, which was a great contrast to the Zionist organization colonies. Another example was there was a Jewish landowner who was being pressured by the Zionist organization to to stop employing Arab workers on his farm. And he was against that. He didn't want to do that, number one, because he was friends with them. And he told the British, like, I'm against this policy because, number one, we have friendly relations, and why would I want to ruin that? And then two, because they were good workers, and he wanted to keep them employed. But he was pressured as a Jewish landowner to essentially fire all of his Arab employees and hire Jews only. And so you have, the British investigations were really quite thorough and detailed in documenting that, contrary to the Zionist propaganda narrative, where you have the outbreaks of 1920, 1921, the Hebron massacre in 1929, we're told that these are proof that Arabs, the root cause is just inherent Arab hatred of Jews. But the British conclusions in every instance was that no, the problem is that the Arabs are becoming increasingly aware of how the Zionists aim to subject and dispossess them. And then they quoted, like from saying things like, and this isn't just among the more extreme elements of Zionism. And you had, like leading members of the Zionist movement coming out and telling the British, about how that was their aim. They wanted to subject and dispossess the Arabs. They wanted to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state. So I don't know how you can reasonably deny that this was a settler-colonial project. By definition, that's what it was. And another interesting point is that when I said in the debate, if Israel were a democracy, it would be called Palestine, I'm alluding to this origin of the conflict because the Arabs at the time, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and the British occupied Palestine. Well, the Arabs were demanding recognition of Palestine's independence, which they had been promised. The Arabs supported the war effort based on the promise that Britain was going to support the independence of Arab territories from Ottoman rule, from Turkish rule. And of course, they reneged on that promise when it came to the Arabs of Palestine, Arab Palestinians. And so democracy was fine as long as Jews were a majority. And so as long as Jews weren't the majority, they were going to deny any form of democratic government to the people of Palestine. So that was the nature of the occupation. This specific purpose of Britain's belligerent occupation of Palestine was to deny the Palestinians their right to self-determination. It was the whole purpose of the occupation, so that the British would facilitate the Zionist project, the Zionist settler-colonial project.
See, I think that's that because I wanted to ask you also about the 1920, 1929, those events, because in some ways, I hate to do it because everybody's done atrocities, and certainly Israel doesn't want to do a body count on this, but everybody, on both sides have done terrible things to each other, and so it turns into a Hatfield McCoy thing, and so I almost hate that kind of argument, although that's the nature of it. Like, it is a violent, terrible thing that's going on even to today. But so you know, in order to understand that, we have to understand what happened in 1920, because sounds Eli made it sound like, and I've heard it all my life, that the Arabs just didn't like the Jews. They didn't like that they were taking over their land, and so they rose up it was violent because of racism. Um, so is that what happened?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, the British, after every one of those outbreaks of violence, had commissions of inquiry, looking at the question of what was the cause, like why did Arabs react this way? Why was there this outbreak of violence? And they very convincingly argued that it wasn't due to any kind of inherent anti-Semitism. In fact, they pointed out things like that Arab leaders expressed a willingness to to help to absorb Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, provided that Western countries like the U.S. and Britain also did their share to absorb refugees. So it was very clear that it wasn't an issue of, although certainly there is, I'm not denying that there is anti-Semitism, and at the time among Arabs, but it wasn't a characteristic of the Palestinians. It wasn't a character trait, and they pointed out that before the Zionist movement, Jews and Arabs in Palestine, had friendly relations. It wasn't until the Zionist movement that you started seeing these outbreaks of violence. And the British pointed this out, that it was because it wasn't inherent anti-Semitism. It was the growing fears the growing recognition, number one, of how their promise of independence had been denied and reneged by the British, and how the British had betrayed them in order to essentially to facilitate the Zionist project to reconstitute Palestine, Arab Palestine, into a demographically Jewish state. Their realization that they were being deprived of their rights, including their right to self-determination, led to growing fears and frustrations among the Arab population, understandably. Which isn't to say that the attacks were justified, of course, but it's one thing to understand. To understand is not to justify.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean there's not a reason,
Right. And so that's what we need to, not to justify, but to understand and to, what were the real reasons for it. And the British did a really, you read their reports and they're very persuasive in arguing against the idea that it was just, expressions of anti-Semitism.
Right. Okay. Okay. So that kind of brings me to another point that Eli made that I think you can see is maybe legitimate, which is, well, hundreds of thousands of millions of Jews have been, kicked out of Arab lands, kicked out of Europe, kicked out of Asia, kicked out of a lot of places for anti-Semitic reasons, and that they need a homeland, a specific Jewish-run, controlled homeland for the survival of their people.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's okay then for them to have, for example, I think the argument of why they have such laws against or maybe in favor of Jews in Israel is because they need that in order to maintain their people. And is that not a legitimate concern that if if Israel were to go away, or if if they conceded in any way, not only would Israel be wiped off the map, but potentially genocide on their part.
Yeah, you could refer to expulsions of Jews from Arab states, both before and after 1948, and also, the Holocaust is always cited as kind of a justification for, the Jews need a state of their own. But the problem with that argument is that the Palestinians weren't responsible for any of those crimes against Jews. So why should they be made to pay the price for them? Why should the Palestinians have been made to pay the cost for the Holocaust, with their rights being systematically violated, with their right to self-determination being denied? It just is completely inequitable and unjust to treat the Palestinians that way due to the crimes of Arab states or European countries against Jews, for which Palestinians bore no responsibility whatsoever. So that's the problem with the argument. It's yeah, sure. There was a lot of prejudice against Jews and crimes against Jews and violation of Jews' rights, including genocide in Europe. But that doesn't justify crimes against the Palestinians and violation of Palestinians' rights. And so that's the problem with the argument. It is prejudicial against Palestinians' rights.
I think so. So I know that the topic of the debate was what's the root cause of the conflict, which I think is important to get to. But I also think that, and we talked about it before, but I want to press this point because I think it's maybe the most emotional and the best argument for how Israel's handling things today, and that is the perception. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the perception that anytime the heavy hand of Israel is lightened, you have suicide bombers, you have rockets, you have Israel under attack. So if a government is legitimate at all, its purpose is to protect the people that is there. So how is that not a legitimate argument? I think that's really maybe the most important argument that we need to discuss today.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one argument we hear all the time is that, well, look, Israel left Gaza in 2005, and all it got in return was incessant rocket fire from Hamas, which is simply ahistorical. It's just not true. It's not what happened. So first of all, the occupation of Gaza did not end in 2005. Israel remained the occupying power and remains the occupying power in Gaza due to its total control over the territory. It withdrew soldiers and evacuated settlers from Gaza as part of what Ariel Sharon called his disengagement plan. The explicit purpose of which was to essentially to enable Israel to define its own borders. That was Sharon's aim. Is like, forget the peace process, the so-called peace process. But even though that the entire peace process was really framed in favor of Israel, with great prejudice toward the Palestinians, even that was too much for Sharon, right? Same as it's too much for Netanyahu. Like, even that was like, no, because they want all the land, but without the Palestinians. And so the whole idea of the disengagement plan was to basically give up on Gaza in terms of, okay, Gaza's not gonna become part of, what we consider to be Israeli territory. We're not going to settle it. We're going to withdraw the settlements from Gaza, and we're going to focus on the West Bank, and we're going to settle the West Bank, and we're going to put all our energy there, including shifting military resources toward that aim. At the same time, ensuring that there's no movement towards peace negotiations with the Palestinian leadership. In fact, Ariel Sharon's top advisor, Dov Weissglass, it was explicit about that. He described the disengagement plan as the formaldehyde. He described it as formaldehyde that kind of puts, that basically makes a corpse out of the so-called peace process. Right. So that it ensures that there won't be any kind of peace negotiations with the Palestinians. And therefore, Israel can just define its own borders. It can settle the land that it wants. It can, and essentially de facto annex the territory that it wants. So that was the disengagement plan. And so under the disengagement plan, Israel did withdraw soldiers and settlers from Gaza. But as I mentioned, it maintained its status as occupying power under international law because it retained control over Gaza. It controls the land crossings, Gaza's territorial waters, Gaza's airspace. It retained administrative functions over Gaza. And under international law, Israel is obligated to provide for the population of the occupied territory. That means Israel is responsible. It's obligated to make sure that the people living in Palestine have sufficient goods and services, food, and what happened. And so there was the withdrawal in 2005. At the same time, in 2005, in 2004 and 2005, Hamas started participating in elections. In early 2004, this is really important context to debunk this whole narrative. In early 2004, in January 2004, Hamas founder Sheikh Ahmed Yassin announced a shift in Hamas policy, where he said that Hamas would be willing to accept a Palestinian state alongside Israel along the pre-June 1967 lines. So he was calling for an end to the occupation, saying we can accept 22% of historic Palestine as a Palestinian state with a long-term truce with Israel to establish mutual intent. So this was a policy shift from Hamas, and Israel's response to that offer was to assassinate Sheikh Yassin. And then his successor, like within a month after that, his successor was also assassinated by Israel, which of course had the effect of kind of sidelining the more moderate elements within Hamas and empowering the more extremist elements within Hamas. But nevertheless, Hamas maintained that position for years and years afterwards. And there's all kinds of quotes from Hamas officials where they're repeating that offer, saying we can accept a Palestinian state alongside Israel on the 1967 borders, with a long-term truce to establish mutual intent, and without prejudice towards the right of Palestinian refugees to return. That's been their position. In 2017, they issued a policy document that The Guardian and other Western media described as a new charter, where they explicitly stated that their conflict isn't with Jews because they're Jewish or because of the religion or their race. It's with Zionism because of the fact that the Zionist project, since its early implementation, starting after World War I, has always denied the Palestinians their right to self-determination. So they had this policy document that was explicitly anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic. And so you've had these moves from Hamas toward, kind of moving away from armed conflict toward diplomacy, toward engagement in the political process. And to that end, Hamas announced that it was a ceasefire, a unilateral ceasefire. It was going to not launch any rockets or launch any attacks while it participated in Palestinian elections. And so in 2004, 2005, in keeping with this new policy declaration, Hamas participated in municipal elections and in numerous cases defeated Fatah, which is the party of Mahmoud Abbas, the party of Yasser Arafat, taking over control of local councils. And then in 2006, there was parliamentary elections, and Hamas defeated Fatah in that election. And so the result was a Hamas-led Palestinian government in the occupied territories. Israel's response to that, and the U.S.'s response to that, was to do everything it could to undermine the new government. And in fact, they conspired with Fatah to try to overthrow the democratically elected government. And so this is what is referred to in the media. We hear that there was a violent Hamas coup, and that's how Hamas took power in Gaza, which is actually like inverts reality, because the truth is that there was an attempted coup supported by Israel and the U.S. to overthrow the elected government. And that is why, to this day, you have this divided leadership between the PA in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. It's a direct consequence of Israel's own policies. Of instead of encouraging this evolution of Hamas away from, armed conflict to engagement in the political process. They could have encouraged that shift, just like the PLO before it. The PLO had been recognized as a terrorist organization, but Arafat became recognized as a legitimate partner for peace, renouncing terrorism, accepting the two-state solution. And that was the threat. That was the threat from Hamas, that Hamas was going to become more moderate, just like the PLO before it had, and accept the two-state solution and become a peace partner. And that was the last thing that Israel wanted, was for Hamas to become a peace partner. So they did everything, Israel did everything in its power through its policies to ensure that Hamas remained a radical terrorist organization.
Well, what about the argument that yes, they had elections and Hamas came to power, but there hasn't been elections since, and so
Yeah.
how is Palestine?
Well, yeah, Abbas's term ended in 2009, so he's not a legitimate leader. The Palestinians really have no legitimate leadership. But again, this is a direct consequence of U.S. and Israeli policies, where they won't allow elections, essentially, because Hamas would participate. And they can't allow Hamas to participate in elections like they did in 2004, 2005, and 2006.
Was that an embarrassment, or was that because I could see both sides from Israel's standpoint? Like like we've talked about Israel wanting Hamas to be propped up because then they don't have a legitimate partner, but at the same time, they could be embarrassed by the fact that, wow, look, here's Hamas as the now a potential legitimate government in Palestine.
Yeah, Israel did not want to see Hamas elected to power. And so it was trying to undermine the elections. It wouldn't allow Hamas candidates run in occupied East Jerusalem, for example. And so the U.S. funded, in violation of Palestinian law, election law, funded Fatah against Hamas. So the U.S. and Israel were trying to undermine the elections. They were interfering in the elections to try to undermine Hamas and to prevent Hamas from gaining political power through democratic elections.
They just wanted Hamas to be this fringe group that they could always use to keep from the peace process from continuing.
Precisely. Okay. Right. And so this is what I mean when I say that Hamas is its existence is a consequence of Israel's policies, and its continued extremist nature, its terrorist nature, is a consequence of Israel's policies and the U.S.'s policies. And so it's just not the case that the Palestinians are incapable of reasoning. This is what we're supposed to believe. They have, the Palestinian leadership, again, has offered incredible concessions historically. And if you want to know who the true rejectionists are, as I pointed out in the debate, it's a matter of public record. Every year in the General Assembly, there are two resolutions that are put up to a vote. One is it's titled something like a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict, something like that. Where it's just a reiteration of the two-state solution. And it kind of details what the elements of the two-state solution are, including an end to the occupation and a just resolution to the refugee problem. And the other resolution is a very short resolution. It's just simply titled the Palestinian, the right of Palestinians to self-determination. And that's all the resolution does. It simply reaffirms that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. It's it. It's a very short, simple resolution. Every year on both of those resolutions, the U.S. joins Israel and a handful of Pacific states like Palau and Marshall Islands, essentially U.S. client states, a handful, defy the world in voting no to both of those resolutions. So who are the rejectionists? It's Israel and the U.S. And the entire U.S.-led so-called peace process has always been the means by which Israel and its superpower benefactor blocked implementation of the two-state solution, because there's a deception about the peace process. We're supposed to believe that the U.S. declares and Israel declares that they accepted Resolution 242 as the basis for peace negotiations. But that's a big deception, because Resolution 242 called on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories in accordance with the principle of international law that the acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible. And the Security Council's intent, explicitly stated intent, you can go back to the UN meeting records, the explicit intent of the Security Council was that Israel must fully and immediately withdraw to the armistice lines, the pre-June 5th, 1967 lines. But Israel has its own unilateral interpretation of 242. So under Israel's unilateral interpretation, which has no validity under international law, under its alternative interpretation, the Palestinians must negotiate with their oppressors, with the occupying power, over how much of their own land they can keep and maybe someday exercise some kind of limited autonomy over, while Israel continues to prejudice the outcome of those negotiations with its persistent, continued illegal settlement regime in the occupied territories, which is completely incompatible with principles of international law. But that is the framework that the U.S. adopted as the basis, the foundation for the peace process. So the two-state solution is distinct from a two-state solution that you hear U.S. and Israeli officials talk about. They're two completely different things. The two-state solution, in favor of which there is an virtual international consensus and has been since the early 70s, the two-state solution is premised on the applicability of international law to the conflict, whereas the entire US-led so-called peace process was premised on a rejection of the applicability of international law to the conflict. And this prejudice is observable in Western media reporting when they say things like, oh, Israel has offered concessions. Israel has offered to cede land. Well, none of the land is Israel's to cede. And all of the generous offer was Israel demanding the Palestinians to cede Palestinian land to Israel. So this was the entire nature of the peace process. It was the means by which essentially the U.S. helped Israel to block implementation of the two-state solution and implementation of Resolution 242. So the U.S. policy essentially prolonged the occupation, supported the occupation, supported the settlement regime as well, despite rhetoric, where U.S. officials sometimes have, in the title of my book, Obstacle to Peace, is taken in part from this, where they have, U.S. officials sometimes describe the settlements as an obstacle to peace. Alternatively, that phrase has been used to describe the Palestinian leadership, Arafat being an obstacle to peace, for example.
Right.
So I'm borrowing the title of my book from those two applications of the term. So you hear this phrase used to describe the settlement sometimes, but actions are more important than words when determining what is the policy. And you can just look at the U.S. record in the Security Council of protecting Israel against international censure for its ongoing settlement regime, for its ongoing occupation regime, for its essential apartheid regime.
I want to ask you about the settlement regime because it's a little bit fuzzy in my mind from a standpoint of, I think, similar to the original Zionist plan to purchase land and to to settle in that way. Is that what's happening, or is land being purchased maybe under fake names or entities, and then it turns out to be Jewish settlements that get pushed into there? How does this work, and why is that a violation of law and what what the Palestinians don't want?
There may be instances in which there are purchases of land, but essentially that's not what's happening. Essentially, you have a military occupation of the West Bank, and Israel just moves in and takes over land and settles it.
Okay.
With
so
great prejudice.
Annex, just saying we're moving the wall from here to here.
Well, and then that's the other thing. In 2004, the International Court of Justice, at the request of the UN General Assembly, issued an advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the wall that Israel was constructing in the West Bank, which is essentially an annexation wall. They built the wall through the West Bank. It runs deeply within the West Bank, within occupied territory, to essentially, effectively, to annex the major settlement blocks in the West Bank. And of course, the ICJ ruled that, number one, all of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, remains occupied Palestinian territory. The settlements are a violation of international law. The wall that Israel built is a violation of international law. There's just no question about this whatsoever. It's just a simple point of fact that the settlement regime is a violation of international law. It's illegal. So it's not a situation where Israel is like somehow legally acquiring land and then settling it. It's the entire regime is a violation of international law.
Right. Okay.
And there's no dispute about this whatsoever. I mean, you'll hear, Israel has its own lawyers and things, and there are Zionists who will try to claim that, there's some kind of legal basis for this. But these arguments are not taken seriously by the international community.
Okay. One of the things that Eli said, which I just want to get your view on this and a comment. He said that the Jews accept that there are two people with legitimate and competing claims to the land. Is that true?
No. To try to draw an equivalence between the claims of the Palestinians, again, going back to the Mandate era, and the Jewish immigrants, there was no equivalence. Again, Jews had purchased only about 7%. They acquired to purchase only about 7% of the land. Arabs owned more land in every single district in Palestine, and again, even within the proposed Jewish state under the UN partition plan, Arabs owned more land. So to claim that Jews had an equal claim to Palestine, which is essentially the argument that was made, that there's an equal legitimate claim to Palestine. He's again relying on this, ancient historical connection, where essentially the argument is that, well, because of their DNA, immigrants from Russia or Europe had some kind of right to property in Palestine.
I don't think he's saying DNA. I think he's saying because of their Jewishness, however that happened.
Right, which is an even kind of a broader argument because it goes beyond the DNA and says, well, even if you have no ancient historical connection to the land, just because you converted to Judaism, therefore you have somehow inherent property rights in the territory known as Palestine, which is utterly ludicrous. I mean, it's an absurd concept.
Okay, so and this is on the subject, I promise, but it's interesting to me because we've talked about that I'm a Mormon a little bit, and one of the things that a lot of people know, some people don't, is I'll say my people, whatever that means. It wasn't me, but my ancestors, I suppose, was kicked out of Illinois, was kicked out of Missouri. In fact, there was an expulsion and execution order for any Mormon in Missouri that was only rescinded in 1973. So I'm not comparing it to what's happening to the Palestinians or to the Jews or anything like that. But here's my point. And it's interesting, it just happened just yesterday. The church acquired the Kirtland Temple and a bunch of stuff from a breakoff church, and I think one could say that you can make an argument that, hey, I should be able to go to Missouri under the same argument that Eli's making, that I can go to Missouri and take somebody's house, that I can say, hey, wait a sec, you guys stole this land from me, or you guys, this was our land. I think there'd be a better case for that than what's happening to the people in Palestine.
Sure.
And so you see the differences of somebody acquiring land legitimately, that used to be theirs, and they're bringing it back, and they're trying to do things in the right way. I have lots of problems with church leadership, trust me, but this is the right way to do it versus what's happening in on a much more violent, much bigger, more international scale that's happening with Israel and Palestine.
Sure. And so this goes back to the question of property rights. And so if you can show legal title to a piece of property from which um, your ancestors were expelled, and show that you are the legal inheritor of that property, that you have the legitimate title to that land, because that land was illegitimately expropriated, then you have a right to reclaim that property. And if so, time itself serves as a kind of statute of limitations, because the further you go back in history to the original claim, the harder it is to show current modern legal title over that property. And so you have a situation where people argue that, oh, well, there was a kingdom of Israel, in the 12th century BC. uh,
Well,
so
there's lots of statues there. There's lots of, we have a text that says that.
yeah. So it's because thousands of years ago there was a kingdom of Israel there, and then also Jewish presence in the land, up through the Roman era, and we hear that there was the rebellion. The temple was destroyed in 70 BCE. I'm sorry, 70 CE, Common Era, and also the Bar Kokhba revolt after that, in which there was a huge depopulation, either through extermination or flight of Jews. But there was a persistent Jewish presence still in the Galilee, for example, in Samaria. They weren't all expelled. So there were Jews who had kind of maintained a presence in the land since time immemorial. And I pointed this out in the debate, that there were indigenous Jews living in Palestine during the Mandate era, just as there were indigenous Palestinians. Interestingly, much of the biblical narrative is not supported by archaeological evidence. And a really important example is the idea that the Israelites, were foreigners, outsiders, who violently conquered Canaan, and including through genocide of Canaanite tribes. And actually, the DNA evidence shows that this is actually not true, that the Israelites were Canaanites. They were indigenous to that area. They weren't foreigners. They didn't invade the land from outside. And in fact, archaeologists today distinguish Canaanites from Israelites not through like genetic distance, but because of the Israelites' own different self-identity. They didn't identify as being one of the Canaanite tribes, but genetically, that's where they were from. As are Palestinians. Palestinians are also descended. They have a very strong genetic connection to the Levant. They're descended from Canaanites. So Arabs and Jews are actually ancestrally brothers and sisters. And in fact, the people most closely related to Jewish groups in the world are the Palestinians, the Druze, and the Bedouin. So they're both, they both have an ancient historical connection to the land of Palestine. But one distinction there is that while anyone can convert to Judaism, there's no equivalent ability. Arabs, you can't just convert and become a Palestinian and
again why
claim that land.
Which is why the property rights is got to be the only rule of law that is right. Available, because it's the only way that settles the question.
Right. It has to come back to legitimate property rights. And so I actually debated, this was my third ever debate, actually. The two previous debates are both also on Israel-Palestine on Tom Wood's show. And I debated that very question of property rights. And there was Walter Block and Rafi Farber and Alan Futterman had written a paper in which they claim that because of their ancient historical connection, that Jews had legal title ownership to the land of Palestine. It was their land, and they had a right to take it back, including through force, if necessary. So they made that argument in this paper. But I actually, debating that issue, and then after I first debated Rafi Farber quite a number of years back, And I made the point that well, through your own argument of libertarian principles of what property rights means, is you have to actually be able to trace legal title of specific individual Jews back 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, and be able to trace those property rights to specific individual Jews alive today. And Farber acknowledged, and the debate kind of continued on our blogs afterwards and on Twitter, and he acknowledged that they're not capable of doing that. In fact, in the paper itself that they published, they acknowledge that they can't actually do that. And they acknowledge that they're departing from libertarian principles in making their argument. So it's at the same time, they try to maintain that they're making the libertarian case for Israel. So it's kind of a self-contradiction. But this is the case. Whereas you have Palestinians who, in much more recent history, within the last 100 years, who, with just a few generations, you have Palestinians who still hold the keys to the homes that they were expelled from back in 48, where you do have the ability of Palestinians to trace property rights to areas in what is now Israel. Although over 400 villages were literally wiped off the map during the 48 war to make sure that Palestinians had no homes to return to. But, and this is another area where the leadership has made concessions, because Arafat didn't expect, while he insisted on recognition of the right of return, he didn't expect that all the Palestinian refugees and their descendants would return to what is now Israel. He recognized that would both be impracticable, and he took the position that he didn't want the right of return to mean the end of Israel's existence as a demographically Jewish state. That wasn't what he was aiming at. He just wanted acknowledgement of that they have a right to return to their homes, whether they actually return to that area or not. And if not, then, there should be compensation. There should be some kind of, where they do need to be resettled, whether in the Palestinian state or in some other Arab states. And there should be compensation for lost property. He wasn't insistent on, they're all just going to go back to Israel, and, and we're going to end Israel's existence as a Jewish state with this flood of refugees into Israel. That wasn't what he was demanding. And so, this is the point, that there does have to be, it was a historical injustice that needs to be righted.
Right.
And until these historical injustices are righted,
acknowledged.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And at least acknowledged. And this is the fundamental problem, is that, there's just an unwillingness to acknowledge these historical injustices. And without acknowledgement, it's just, there's no way to advance toward any kind of just peace. There can't be peace without acknowledging the wrongs that have been done, including on both sides, obviously.
Well, I wanted to ask,
sorry, you're breaking up.
Oh, hello, testing 1 2.
I can hear you now, but your video's frozen. Oh, there we go.
Okay. My question, and this is more of a philosophical, what if scenario. Wouldn't, or maybe even psychological, I don't know. Could one make the case, as wrong as it is, or as evil as the state of Israel has been to the Palestinians, that would be better off for the Palestinians to find a way to leave, go to another place, resettle, and start over?
It's challenging, because going back to, again, the 48 war and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, many Arab Palestinians did resettle in other Arab states, such as Jordan. But, the Arab states were willing essentially to accept the well-to-do Arabs, which were largely the Christian Arab population from the cities who had fled. Because essentially they were willing to accept refugees who would be able to take care of themselves, and not become dependent on social welfare. And so this is a problem where the Arab states do not want to absorb refugees who are dependent on humanitarian aid, which is so there's economic reasons for the kind of the unwillingness of Arab states to just absorb many refugees. Also, there's the issue that Palestinian refugees, they don't want to relocate. Palestine is their home. They feel very connected to the land and attached to it. They just want to live in their homeland, and that's their prerogative. That's their right. And so we need to respect that. But I'm sure that there would probably be a significant number who would be willing to relocate into whatever Arab state or whatever other country. And so that's part of a solution, I think. But they have to be willing to do that. They can't be forced to relocate. And then also, there's the issue of compensation. And frankly, with respect to the return of refugees to what is now Israel, I don't think, my view is that we ought to move humanity toward becoming civilized. And to me, it's just completely uncivilized to have a state defined on the basis of race/religion, where Arabs are second-class citizens because they're not Jewish. If there was a state where Jews were second-class citizens because they're not Arabs, people roundly recognize this as wrong and that this situation shouldn't exist.
They would call it fascist and Nazism.
Right. And so why should the converse situation exist? Israel exists unashamedly as a Jewish supremacist state. And there are many laws on the books in Israel. So it's not just, when it's referred to as an apartheid regime, it's not just looking at the occupied territories and the systematic violation of Palestinians' rights in the territories. It's also within Israel itself, where you have all kinds of laws on the books that are greatly prejudicial to Arab inhabitants of Israel and Arab citizens. For example, we always hear that, Israel is a democracy and Arabs can run for the Knesset and participate in the government. Well, that's true, but on the precondition that they accept essentially their status as second-class citizens. They have to. No party can run for political office in Israel under the law if if the candidate or the party takes a position that there should be full equality between all citizens. That's in the law of Israel. So it's just there's the Jewish nation state law, which was 2017, I think, was passed, upheld by the Israeli Supreme Court, which literally defines self-determination in the territory under Israel's control as a right that's exclusive to Jews. Well, so it's not a democracy. Let's end this whole charade, this whole facade that Israel is a democracy. It's not a democratic form of government.
Well, I think so many people see it as a modern government, therefore it must be democracy.
Yeah, and they equate, there's elections and there's a parliament, the Knesset is Israel's legislature. And so people have this view, and Arabs can run for office, and there's Arab members of the Knesset, and these arguments are used to try to uphold this claim that Israel is a democracy. But again, looking at the democratic solution that was proposed by the Arabs after World War I and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, this is what I mean when I say if Israel were a democracy, it would be called Palestine, because the democratic solution was proposed by the Arabs. It was explicitly rejected by the Zionists and the British. So Israel exists as a Jewish state precisely because of its undemocratic nature. Because if Israel were a democracy and Palestinians living within the territory under its control had a right to vote and participate in the government, guess what would happen?
Yeah, and this goes back to what what you said in the debate and what I've been trying to say all over the place, and you said it perfectly. You said that you know states don't have rights, people have rights, and so um, the to say like you can create a state and then just oppress the people that are living there just for the sake, just because they live there, and then eventually kick them out. I mean that is not it's not legitimate in any kind of modern civilized sense, as you say.
Correct. Yeah, it's not a legitimate form of government. And so the point I made in the debate is that, number one, the whole concept of a state having a right to exist is a logical absurdity. Arbitrarily defined political entities do not have rights. Individual human beings have rights. And, so individuals have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The sole legitimate purpose of a state government is to protect the rights of the individuals living within its legally defined territory. And so when people exercise their right to liberty collectively by working together to create a government for the purpose of protecting their rights, this is known in international law as the right to self-determination. And so this is the proper framework for discussion, is not the right of this or that state to exist, but the right of all peoples, of both Jews and Arabs, to self-determination.
Right, because
Obviously,
the implication is at any point that government does not protect their rights, anybody at any time has the right to leave and form their own government or do something else.
right, governments derive just powers only from the consent of the governed. So if we believe in these principles, if we believe in the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the ideals upon which the United States was founded, setting aside, the hypocrisy of continued slavery and the ethnic cleansing and genocide of native populations, there's plenty of sins in the U.S. government's creation and establishment. But there were lofty ideals expressed by Thomas Jefferson and others about what it means. They did advance the idea of liberty and freedom. Beyond, we saw the Magna Carta, where it was kind of an end of divine right of kings to rule. And so the founding fathers of the United States did, it was innovative, and it was a new form of government. And for all its failings, it is, in my opinion, still one of the best governments out there. As much as I criticize it, and I personally wouldn't want to live anywhere else other than the United States. It's my home. I think it's a great country, setting aside the problems with the government. But so we have these ideals of what it means to be civilized, and what it means to have freedom, and what it means to have democratic form of government. Obviously not pure democracy, because the founding fathers were against pure democracy, but representative Republican form of government, which is sometimes called representative democracy, as opposed to a pure democracy, which was mob rule, or as Benjamin Franklin described it, two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. That's democracy. So they were opposed to pure democracy. But point being, yes, we're supposed to have these ideas about what it means to be civilized. And we're so far from being civilized as a society that, I really, this is kind of my aim in everything I do, is let's get there, right? Let's do better.
Well,
Let's improve.
It's funny how people kind of show their colors. And I pulled this quote from Eli because to me, it just was like a bright, bold color hitting me, because he talked about how the Jews, which they do, they pray that for a return to Jerusalem, and that's one of their great beliefs. But then he said, "If you will it, it is no dream." And I just thought, well, wow, that's not only is that full of hubris, but like boy, did they will a state out of that one. I mean, the implication of that is might overwrite for sure, and hey, it's probably God's will, because you lost.
Yeah, I think that was essentially an expression of might makes right. whereas I was arguing in favor of the rule of law. And I also pointed out that not only the British, the significance, the historical significance of the infamous Balfour Declaration of 1917 is that it put Great Britain on a policy course that ultimately facilitated the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The League of Nations was complicit in instituting a mandate over Palestine that was directly contrary to the League of Nations' own charter, because the whole purpose of the mandatory system under the charter was to, quote unquote, tutor the peoples of formerly Ottoman territories in their exercise of political independence and in the exercise of their right to self-determination. So this was the whole purpose of the mandate system under the League of Nations charter, and yet the Palestinians were denied that right. The whole purpose of the mandate, specifically in the territory of Palestine, was to deny that right to the Palestinians. So the League of Nations was complicit. And when the League of Nations was replaced by the UN system, the UN was complicit. The partition plan, they was utilized by the Zionists. It was that Resolution 181 was cited in their unilateral declaration of the existence of the State of Israel, as though that resolution conferred some kind of legal authority to the Zionists for their declaration, in which they didn't define their borders in the declaration. They just said that the Jewish state now exists here in the place of this place called Palestine, which was obviously intentional because they wanted all of the land, and they weren't willing, even though they expressed acceptance of the partition plan, they had designs on all of the territory of Palestine, all of Eretz Israel, which is the land of Israel, which, in the mind of the Zionist was from the river to the sea, minimally from the river to the sea, because you had the more extreme Zionists, the Jabotinsky brand of Zionists, who also saw Jordan and Transjordan as part of Eretz Israel. And so you had the UN was complicit when the U.S. Because they had this partition plan that was utilized by the Zionists to try to lend legitimacy to territorial conquest by war, which was contrary to the UN Charter. You had the UN admitting Israel as a member state despite lacking legally defined borders, which is one of the criteria for membership. Internationally recognized borders is a criteria for membership. You had Israel manifestly not being a peace-loving state. It was literally created by ethnically cleansing most of the Arab population. Around 750,000 Arabs were made refugees. So how could Israel be described as a peace-loving state when that's how it was literally created? So it manifestly didn't meet that criteria for membership. And the Israeli leadership absolutely refused to allow refugees to return to their homes upon the cessation of hostilities, despite the right of return being internationally recognized in UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of December 1948. And so you had Israel openly defying and objecting to the idea of it meeting its obligations under the UN Charter, which is another requirement for admission of membership to the UN. So the UN, admitting Israel as a member in this situation, when Israel manifestly failed to meet the criteria for membership, was incredibly prejudicial to the Palestinians, because the UN was basically giving its rubber stamp of approval to the territorial conquest of the Zionists of 78% of historic Palestine, and rejecting the Palestinians' right of return. It was extraordinarily prejudicial against the Palestinians' rights to return to their homes, or if their homes had been destroyed, to some kind of compensation and recompense for that violation and that injustice. And so the UN itself was complicit in this ethnic cleansing. And so, there's this whole narrative that we're supposed to believe historically that the Palestinians were the villains. But they were just powerless victims. And we're told that the Arabs started the war in 1948. I mean, you read Benny Morris, the preeminent Israeli historian describing the situation. Essentially, he even says, like the Arabs had essentially lost the war back in the late 30s with the Arab Revolt, 1936 to 1939, that the British violently crushed, and largely disarmed the Arab population of Palestine. They were just so weak; they had no power whatsoever. Not only they had no political power because the British denied any kind of political power to them, again, just denying their right to form an independent state of their own. They had no military power. Their militias were essentially, you had villagers who had a rifle. That was their militias, and they were mainly just set about just trying to defend villages. You had Plan Dalet, Plan D. In April 1948, the Zionists detailed a plan where their commanders were basically given the option of expelling villages if they met with any resistance whatsoever. They were told that they were authorized by the Zionist leadership to go ahead and just expel all of the villagers from the village. And Benny Morris described from that point forward, from April 48 onward, he described what the Zionists were engaged in as a, quote, war of conquest. So this whole idea that this war was started by the Arabs, it was a war of territorial conquest by the Zionists. And again, by the end of the war, they had conquered territory well beyond the partition proposal. And so you have all these kind of historical myths that are really aimed at essentially trying to manufacture consent for the U.S. government policy of supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinians.
I think it's interesting how, as powerful as the Israel lobby is in America, and it's quite powerful, how so few, and maybe it is another tragedy of the Holocaust that we can't question anybody's motives anymore. If somebody, when John F. Kennedy ran for president, his motives were definitely questioned about, because he was the first Catholic, and whether he was going to make decisions based on what the Pope said, and these things happen. And yet we can't question our politicians today and the Israeli policy that they hold, without looking at who's bankrolling them and who's supporting their candidacy and such.
Yeah, as far as bankrolling, going back again to the Balfour Declaration, one of the purposes for that, if you look at what it was a letter written from Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, who of course was a preeminent banker. It was one of the purposes, as you can learn if you read the Peel Commission and so on, and the British government's own documents from the era. They're very open and explicit about the motives for expressing support for the Zionist movement, one of which was to gain Jewish support for the war effort, including, of course, from the banking family. Anti-Semitism was another factor, because European countries were happy to see Jews leave
anywhere
Europe
else, right,
and go to Palestine. In fact, one of the documents, the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry report, I think it was, mentioned how there was support for the Zionist policy because Jews would be welcomed in Palestine. They would receive a welcome in Palestine, unlike anywhere else. And so, again, there was this recognition that before the Zionist movement, Jews and Arabs had peaceful relations in Palestine. But moving back to kind of more today, so you had that interest back in the day, in terms of bankrolling and whatnot. Today, of course, the U.S. government supplies Israel with billions annually in military aid, which serves as an effective subsidy to the military-industrial complex.
Yep. Just something to think about as we're heading into tax season, people.
Yes, certainly. I would love to be able to protest and just not pay taxes on the grounds that I object to my hard-earned dollars being forcibly expropriated from me for the purpose of supporting a genocide. Of course, I'm a father and a husband, and so the risk to me of doing that act of civil disobedience is too great. But we Americans need to recognize that we are funding this and we are supporting it. The U.S. government has 3 times now used its veto power in the UN Security Council to block ceasefire resolution, despite the entire global humanitarian community, all the human rights organizations and the humanitarian aid organizations, just this chorus from the entire community around the globe for 5 months now saying Palestinians are dying. Israel is using starvation as a method of warfare. And it's the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the century, of the 20th century. And without a ceasefire, just tens of thousands of more Palestinians are going to die. And so there's just this chorus from the humanitarian community around the globe saying there needs to be a ceasefire because it is really a genocidal situation. And as the ICJ has ruled on January 26th, ruled that for issuing preliminary measures, because South Africa made the argument that, the Palestinians can't wait for months and months and months for the ICJ to deliberate on our case and come to some kind of ruling and decision about, is Israel violating the Genocide Convention? They argued that all we have to do, the South Africa was arguing, all we have to do is to show that there's a plausible case that Israel is committing genocide. And that forces the ICJ to issue preliminary measures. And so the ICJ did rule that South Africa has presented a plausible case that Israel is violating the Geneva Convention. I'm sorry, not the Genocide Convention. And so therefore ordered Israel to comply with the convention, which means stop killing Palestinians indiscriminately, stop blocking humanitarian aid. And so, defenders of Israel's military actions in Gaza try to spin the ICJ's ruling, and they like to. In fact, Eli Lake said this during the debate. He said that, well, the ICJ didn't do what South Africa asked because South Africa had asked the ICJ to order Israel to cease its military operation. The ICJ didn't do that. But it effectively did. And here's why. Because it ordered Israel, again, to comply with the Genocide Convention, which means it has to not just allow humanitarian aid, but it has to itself facilitate and provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. And again, you've had this chorus for 5 months saying that the only way that we can get humanitarian aid into the Strip and distribute it in such a way as to provide for the people's needs to stave off mass death is if there's a humanitarian ceasefire. So effectively, the ICJ did call on Israel to end its military operations and accept a humanitarian ceasefire, in effect. And the U.S. government is supporting what is happening. It's supporting this genocide.
As we're kind of finishing up here, and I appreciate your time, man. I always love having you on. And I did my best to play devil's advocate. I hope we were able to kind of, I hope you're able to get some of those, some of those things out, and kind of getting some more of those details that you aren't able to do in that kind of a forum. Mm-hmm. Kind of critique yourself a little bit. Were there any, do you feel like missed opportunities that you had or things you would have done differently that night?
Yeah, I'm sure, I'm always self-critical. Right. I would have liked to have been able to go deeper into the details on some of the points I raised, because I did kind of touch on a lot of issues. I know I did the 1937 Peel Commission proposal, the UN partition plan. I touched on each of those things, but each one of those points, could be a lengthy discussion in and of itself. So it was very challenging to try to get in the details. I feel I could have gone I didn't really have the opportunity, but I could have discussed the 1967 war more, because Lake tried to make the argument that war, although he acknowledged it was literally started by Israel on the morning of June 5th with a surprise attack on Egypt, but he tried to maintain the narrative that was a preemptive strike, because it was a war of self-defense, essentially, on the part of Israel, because the Arab states kind of had this genocidal intent, and this intent to, as if there was this imminent threat of invasion. That is a point I would have loved to have kind of elaborated on and really debunked that narrative, because there's so many points there. So basically, the argument is that, and this is a really important thing, and I would have liked. This is one area where I really felt I should have kind of discussed more, but I just want to make the point that the argument is Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, and it expelled the UN emergency force UNEF from the Sinai Peninsula. So there was this UN peacekeeping force. It expelled the UN peacekeeping force, and it moved its military into the Sinai Peninsula. And so these are kind of like the key points that are made to try to sustain this narrative that Israel's attack was preemptive, and that it was a preemptive act of self-defense. But it's missing so much context that completely undermines the narrative. So first of all, why were UN peacekeeping forces there in the first place? Because Israel attacked Egypt in 1956. With the Suez Crisis. Israel invaded Egypt. So that's why the peacekeeping forces were there. Secondly, the proposal, one of the reasons that Nasser, Egyptian President Nasser expelled the peacekeeping forces was because he was coming under such criticism from Jordan and Syria for, supposedly hiding behind peacekeeping forces, while Syria and Jordan were dealing with Israel's military on their borders. And of course, Jordan at the time was administrating the West Bank, and so you had, for example, the Israeli attack on the village of Samu, which was to collectively punish the civilian population of this village for an attack by Fatah. I think it was a mining of a jeep was mined or something, and Israeli soldiers were killed along the armistice line. And so, to collectively punish a local civilian population, they attacked this village of Samu in the West Bank. So Jordan was enraged. It looked at Egypt and was criticizing Nasser for hiding behind the UN peacekeeping forces, while the Jordanian administered West Bank was under attack, and so on. And so it was a face-saving measure on the part of Nasser, for one. Secondly, the proposal was made to restation the UN peacekeeping forces on Israel's side of the border, and guess what? Israel refused. What does that tell you about Israel's intentions? And finally, you have, the CIA looked at the troop movements into the Sinai by Egypt, and it observed that they had taken up defensive positions. And the CIA told President Johnson that, war did appear likely, but that if war did outbreak, it would be started by Israel. So they were accurate in that prediction. And they assessed that Israel had such vast qualitative military superiority that it would defeat the combined Arab armies, because of course Egypt and Jordan and Syria had this alliance. It would defeat the combined Arab armies within a matter of weeks, and it took Israel 6 days. And before Israel attacked, Israel's own intelligence had assessed that Nasser had no intention of invading Israel. And they had a really good reason for coming to that conclusion. They judged that he wasn't insane, because to attack Israel, in their view, he would have to be insane.
Right.
And then you have years later, you had actually in 1968, Yitzhak Rabin, later prime minister, but at the time, a member of the military, saying in 1968 that the troop movements into Egypt don't show that Nasser was intended to attack us. Menachem Begin in 1982 admitted, that the troop movements don't show that Egypt was going to attack. We must be honest with ourselves, he said. We decided to attack him. So this whole narrative of 1967 being this preemptive war is just another element of the Zionist propaganda version of history. And so, that's one area I would have loved to have been able to, if I had
Yeah.
the time, to delve into that, because it's so important. It's such a watershed event for understanding what's happening
Well,
today.
absolutely. That's the war that created the 1967 lines. That's the war that annexed so much of the land, and the problem with, as time goes on, just like it gets harder and harder and harder to prove legitimate ownership and title. It gets harder and harder to uh, the state of Israel, the infrastructure, the people gets embedded into those lands, and it's harder to. It gets a much more complicated issue.
Right, which raises the whole question of, is the two-state solution even feasible anymore? Because you have a lot of advocates of a single state solution, a single democratic state with equal rights for all peoples living in the territory, from the river to the sea. And this is, I'm sure there are anti-Semites who use the slogan "from the river to the sea" to, maybe to the point of even of inciting genocide. I don't, there's anti-Semites in the world, but what most political activists mean when they say "free Palestine from the river to the sea," that's what they're advocating. They're advocating the one-state solution. They're not advocating the elimination of Jews, or, pushing Jews into the sea or something. They're simply advocating a single state solution, a single democratic state. And so, in my view, that is the ideal solution. But the question, of course, is how do you get there? And I do think it is possible, but as a first step, it's almost kind of like pointless to even have that discussion about, like, what would it take? What would the steps be? As long as the US government continues to prolong the conflict and escalate the conflict with its policy of supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. That must come to an end as a first step. And until we get there, that's just, it's almost kind of
Well,
pointless to even have an academic discussion about it.
right, because until that happens, Israel has no incentive to negotiate.
Yes, absolutely. Or to roll back its discriminatory policies, it's a oppressive, institutionalized policies of oppression. Yeah, without U.S. support, Israel could not continue to violate the Palestinians' human rights this way systematically. It's because of U.S. support that Israel is able to do that with impunity. And so end the impunity and start having accountability, including war crimes on both sides. Another benefit of South Africa's case at the ICJ is that it puts pressure on the International Criminal Court, the ICC, a separate body, which actually has the power of prosecution, where the ICJ has no means of enforcing its advisory opinions. But the the ICC can prosecute war crimes, which should happen. War crimes committed by both Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas, and the Israeli military. So there needs to be an end to the impunity, and there needs to be accountability, and that's a first step. Like, that's a necessary first step. And if we can get there, then there's going to be incredibly great hope for a just peace and a permanent peaceful resolution to the conflict. But we have to get there. And so people need to recognize that this is the US government's policy, that the US government is not a neutral mediator. It's not an honest broker. It has, since the beginning of the existence of Israel, supported the Zionist project to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state, and all of the prejudices against the rights of Palestinians that entails. For the entire history of Israel's existence, that's been the case. And so, particularly after 1967, the U.S. became a very enthusiastic supporter of the Israeli government. And of course, there's the billions in military aid.
Right.
So this
There
has
is
to end.
that.
This has to end, and then that's going to be our hope for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Let's get to that point.
Very good. Apparently, I'm getting a phone call. I thought I had it on mute, but here we go. Jeremy, I just want to thank you so much for coming on, man. Obstacle to Peace is your book. That is, I know you have other books, but that's the book that's probably most related to what we've been discussing today. JeremyRHammond.com is the website. Yeah, man, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Glad to be able to kind of delve deeper into some of the points I raised during the debate.
Yeah, I think it's very useful for people who really want to understand. It's so easy to be knee jerk on this subject. It's so easy to go with what you've heard your whole life, or like I said, just go knee jerk into Israel good, Palestine bad, and to really understand the history and what is the root cause for the conflict. It's an eye opener for sure. So I appreciate you opening our eyes today.
Yeah, we have to get the answer to the question of what the root cause is correct.
Yeah.
Otherwise we're going to misdiagnose the problem and offer a misdiagnosis. And so if we want to know what the path is forward to a peaceful resolution, we need to understand the true nature of the conflict. And so that's what I've done my best to try to elucidate and illuminate, both with my book, Obstacle to Peace, and all the writings I've done on this topic.
Mike is gone.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
Gone but not forgotten.
First of 23 installments requested by Dr. Leavitt. Trying to be in compliance here because we're taking him and that whole organization down.
Speak peace like a Buddhist.